Hi, this is Lainey Cameron. I am here with Colleen van Niekerk. And Colleen, I adored this book. I loved the fact that
Thanks.
it took me to South Africa inside a set of struggles I have relatively little understanding of. I mean, like, yes, we all understand the concept of apartheid at the historical level, but it's not something I have as part of my emotional history. And
Mhm.
the way you took us through three generations of women and how each of them was wounded in different ways and how they're
Right.
all trying to kind of, as you would want to, move beyond it, but are struggling
Mhm.
with some of that past, which is some of which is not even their own past, it's generations of past.
Right. Right.
Wow, this novel is outstanding.
Thank you so
Congratulations.
much. Thank you. Thanks very much.
So where are you joining me from today?
So in Vancouver, Canada, that's where I am. That's where I live currently. Well, obviously, I'm South African, but left in my 30s and kind of migrated over to North America. So, yes, so in rainy, the 7-day rain, biblical proportion rain province of BC.
So, for folks who haven't read A Conspiracy of Mothers, maybe try and tell them a little bit about this book. It's a hard one to summarize in a very small, like I was trying to describe it to someone yesterday because I loved it this much and it took me like 2 minutes. And so I'm really interested to see how do you explain this book to someone who might not yet be familiar with it?
Right. So it's really a story about coming home. That's the underlying theme, one of the underlying themes for every character. And the protagonist is a woman who, in 1994, in South Africa, at the sort of on the verge of democratic elections in that country, which was a huge deal because this was sort of the political end of apartheid. She'd been out of the country for 18 years. She had left a newborn child behind, and through the various circumstances, she's drawn back and she returns to the country, but that act of return, kind of triggers this whole string of events that really brings her and her family, her daughter, her mother, face to face with the past and the consequences, of actions taken, two decades previously. So that's kind of the journey that we go on with her through the story.
And it's got three point of view characters. Is that right? Is there more than three?
I think there's five total,
Five.
but
But the
the
three
main ones are
women,
really yes,
the three generations. So we hear from the perspective of her daughter and her mother. And that
that's
was
right.
so powerful to me. Like those perspectives, how you were seeing it across the generations. You portrayed it
Right.
so well. Like I said, I adored this book. So let's take a
Thank
quick
you.
look at a review. Because I always like to give a perspective from, and this is the number one reviewer on Goodreads for your book, and I thought like Daniel captured it so well. The review says this extremely moving novel examines the debilitating effects of apartheid from an intensely personal perspective. The story focuses on three generations of women in the same family, their saga that spans continents and lays bare the consequences of organizing a society by racial classifications. Beautifully written and has strands of maternal love, spiritual connection, and a touch of magic visions. The author has presented us with a sweeping vision of a society struggling with itself as it lurches forward in the hopes of overcoming the difficulties of its past history. And I loved that review because there are so many different themes in this book. Like, this is a brilliant
Mhm.
book club book, but it would also be a brilliant university study book because you're dealing with themes of shame, of inherited history. I mean, how on earth do you? I'm going to skip ahead to a question I asked, like, how on earth do you edit a book like that? Like, were all of those themes in the original book, or did you kind of weave them in as you went through revisions?
Definitely sort of wove them in. I mean, it took a decade to write it, and I think that's kind of the average for any debut or novelist. It takes that long to kind of figure out what you're doing. But it didn't. A lot of those things became evident as I was kind of writing the story and realizing, like the realization that shame is so much a part of this wasn't evident until well into the first a few drafts, and then sort of trying to kind of tease out what do the characters do, and that kind of sort of propels other actions, and that leads to other themes and other realizations that kind of get woven in. So it very much was a work in progress over time, taking time to just to kind of think this through and place it in that context as well of the country, and really understand what would happen here with these characters in these circumstances.
I saw in your book club questions that one of the questions centered around this idea of how shame is used to kind of reinforce systems of racism. And I'd never really
Right.
thought about that before. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So it's one of those things where, like race and racism, especially now in this time with the realizations around social justice for us, it's obviously a very heated and intense space for a lot of us to engage in. And if you kind of really take a good long look at it from all perspectives, it really doesn't matter what race you are. Shame is always there in how you feel when people are behaving that way. If you're someone of color towards you, and how you feel if you're witnessing it. There's a lot of, but it is always the underlying sort of tool that gets kind of employed in service really of racism. So we should really think more about that. I think it really bears consideration.
So, what about the inspiration? Because, like I said, there's so many themes in here, and you do have a
Right.
character who comes to the US. Your main character, Yolanda, is coming to the US from South Africa. Like you say, she left her baby behind. Was that part of what inspired you, your own journey to come to the US, or was it something else? Like, where did this whole idea, kind of the genesis of it, come from?
So it very much it's odd because originally my husband and I immigrated. We moved to the States. We were there, in fact, in Virginia for a period of time. And what I wanted to understand was what home meant, because I was looking at it from the perspective of an immigrant, and home is completely redefined, right? When you have left what you know. So that was part of it, and that was kind of the kernel of the story, as well as really wanting to understand South Africa and just the society that I'd grown up in, where all these things just kind of happen, and that was par for the course. And that's the same for any of us anywhere, wanting to really figure out, well, why did we use the names that we use for different people, and why did we have the structures that we had? So it was a matter of sort of understanding my country from a different outside perspective, to better know my own history in many ways.
I definitely can relate to that. I'm originally from Scotland and now I live in the States, and we're nomads, so we travel the world. And every time I leave a location, it does change my perspective on where I've come from.
Right.
And also, as you
Right.
learn new cultures, it kind of gives you a different perspective on your own culture each time
Yeah.
you appreciate how it's different
Exactly.
in a different place. Yeah.
That's right.
So, so many questions. Like, I don't know where to start with this. Like, so it changed during editing. Like, did it change a lot from the original version over those 10 years?
It didn't. I'm one of those folks who, like, I'm a fully, I'm a pantser. If you're a writer, there are people who outline and people who are pantsers, and I'm a pantser. So I kind of, will focus on characters and listening to what they have to say and who they are. And I think the characters were always pretty clear. There were no major, like the main conflict, the main directors were there from the start. It was just a matter of trying to figure out the craft of actually conveying the story. So, I'm pleased with that, and working with the publisher as well. They were very gracious in that too, in just allowing the story to unfold in this way. So I'm happy that, it kind of kept to the original sort of idea.
And as you're out there taking it out to like readers and you're getting this great feedback about the book, is there anything you've appreciated or has been interesting to you and how people have reacted to it?
I think especially as a debut author, you don't quite know what you're getting into, and especially when you write about race, even more so. I think overwhelmingly, I've just been like deeply just satisfied with people's like emotional response to the story. I had hoped, it was a challenge, for me, that I'd said to myself, to write a story about South Africa for a non-South African audience. We have a hugely complicated society, complex history, and I wanted to convey that in a way that everyone would understand. And I feel like I've done that. But just having people say, I didn't understand. I remember reading a review, and I generally don't, but this one just stayed with me. This was an older woman who had said, I've lived in the South, I've lived in Alabama, and I didn't understand how it felt, what racism felt like. And I was like, my work is done. That's kind of the aim here, is to feel things, because then we can change behavior if we can feel what the other side feels like.
Right. And like South Africa's history is so interesting with apartheid in that it wasn't like two classes of race. Like apartheid tried really hard to create multiple classes and then to create
Exactly.
discord between the classes. And I
Yeah,
feel like I don't know if class is the right word. Like all words are kind of a little fraught here, but like stratification maybe is a better way to say it, but
that's right. Yeah,
but it
yeah.
was class as well, right? Like you had different rights and
It was.
privileges
Yeah,
depending on which tier of you were stratified into. And
yeah.
I think that's not well understood outside of South Africa. Like, even though people are familiar with the
Right,
concept that apartheid give different rights and privileges or lack of privileges to different tiers, I don't think like the gist of how that really felt from inside is something the rest of us have had the chance to really get inside and live. And your novel explained that, and
right,
like you said, got me feeling that and understanding what that must feel like to live with. And obviously, it's only a tiny intro into a world that I will never
right.
live, but I really felt like my own understanding was so much better through reading this novel.
Great, thank you.
So I'm interested in the magical realism. I noticed this gets picked
Mhm.
up quite a bit in your reviews, and I loved it. I loved the concept that the grandmother is really connected to the earth and really connected to the planet, and I thought it, and animals, and I thought it was a superb choice. I'm really interested because it's an interesting choice, right? You've got this model that is
Right.
mostly contemporary, but you decided to include some, I don't even know if magical realism is the right answer, like right wording for it.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
like, can you
yeah.
talk a little bit more about that decision as an author?
Sure. So, I'd wanted to, the story operates at lots of different levels, and I kind of wanted to pay homage to First Nations culture in South Africa as well, which is just hugely denigrated and ignored, and just not given any kind of status or any kind of regard. And it's, and the challenge there is that not a lot of it was documented. So it's tough for us to sort of know, how did they live? How did they think? What did they believe? So I kind of, did my research in that regard for sure. But I wanted to bring that element forward. And, it had to be imaginary. It had to kind of occupy the space of magic realism to kind of have it be tied into the story and have it have relevance. But it's very much, just wanting to provide the view that we had, through colonization and settlement, all of these things were also lost. So apartheid happened at lots of different levels within society, and it happened, the roots are far older than just the political institution and the legislative acts. So that was there, and frankly, I enjoy magic realism. I've read it a great deal. I like, I like speculative fiction, and I wanted to bring that in. But you're right. It's not Gabriel Garcia Marquez, magical realism in that kind of way. It operates differently, and the intent is also there to provide that other dimension and other lessons that still have applicability to the kind of core of the story.
Yeah, I would have described it as like a touch of magical realism. It's not
Yeah,
like, it's not front and center in the story couldn't operate without it, but to me it added
exactly.
to the book and it added to the richness of this novel. Yeah.
Right, right.
So
That's great.
this novel is, like I said, I'm hugely touched and feel educated and enriched by it, and I adored reading it too. What do you advise someone who is going to go through that possibly 10-year journey of writing a debut novel, maybe even wants to write like you have about a topic that people may not be deeply familiar with? Like, do you have
Mhm.
lessons you've learned as you approach this that you might want to share?
Absolutely. I think one of the benefits of, I'm in my 40s. One of the benefits of publishing when you're older is you've had time to know who you are and get to know who you are and what you have to say and why. And I think that's, irrespective of age, I think that's the fundamental sort of action that writers should take. And frankly, any artist is understand your own voice and what you have to say, regardless of, whatever social constructs might tell you about what's appropriate and what sells and whatever the situation is, because you have to. I'll give you an example. I'll segue for a second. I was reading The Quiet American the other day by Graham Greene. I think it was the second time I'd read it. It was published in 1955 and it still has such resonance today, and it just made me realize that what you publish is there for the ages. As long as books are out there, whether they're Kindle form or hardback, they're out there. And you have to have that perspective of you need to be prepared to do the work to put something out there that is you for beyond your lifetime. And if you think about it in that way, I think it sounds serious and big, but it really kind of frames it in the context of you need to be yourself, you need to be authentic, and you need to be clear about what you have to say and how.
Did you have to do anything to find your voice? Like to me, your voice came through very clearly, but did you have to do anything to like find that voice that you felt was uniquely you?
I think I went through the usual kind of rigmarole of writing workshops and conferences and kind of wanting to learn the craft of it. But it's one of those things where honestly just editing and rewriting, because you're working on it so often that you're like, this sounds like how I want it to sound, and this doesn't. I could tell that down to the sentence for this book in the end. So I think it's actually just the doing of it. It's an extraordinary amount of work to publish, to get a book out there. And it's and it's hard, because you kind of, well, do I change this? Is this what I want to say? What's the impact of it? But it's literally just that active doing helps you hone. It's like sculpting. You do it often enough, and you know exactly what you can cut and what you can keep and how you're going to shape it. You know what your skills are, and it's the same action here as well.
I can relate to that. Yeah, I was just having that conversation on a different podcast yesterday about what do I advise people who are starting out, and I was like, do it as opposed to reading about doing it, because only in
Yes,
the act
absolutely.
of writing and revising do you really find what you wanted to say and what your own voice is. And yeah, it's hard. I kind of wished someone had told me that early on. I went the other path and tried to read all the stuff, and that was the wrong way to go, reading all the craft
Right,
books.
right.
So, what impresses you? Have you read anything recently that you would want to highlight for our listeners?
There's a really interesting book. I know there are a lot of books on social justice that are out there, but there's a book by a Canadian author, Ian Williams, that I'm in the middle of, called Disorientation, which is really, really good. Like, he has such a different personal take with really interesting perspectives to offer on this topic. He's writing about his own background and how he sees the world, as a man who's Trinidadian and Canadian and has lived in many different places. So I think that's definitely a worthy read.
Oh, I want to read it. I actually met him in San Miguel. He spoke at the San
Ah,
Miguel
oh
Writers
yeah,
Conference. He gave one of the keynotes, and he was fascinating. So,
right.
okay, I'm
Yeah,
adding
yeah.
adding that
He
one to
has
my
a lot
list
to
right
say.
now. So before we wrap up, I always like to ask, is there anything I haven't asked you that you want to talk about? And especially because this is such a deep book, it covers, like I said, so many themes. Is there anything that you were if you're talking to someone who doesn't know the book, that I haven't asked you that you might
Mhm.
want to cover?
I mean, I think that, the only thing that I would say, and I think we've kind of touched on this, is bring, someone said this to me the other day, in fact, that this book is accessible, and I was like, I never thought about it in that way. Like, you don't need to be a literary anything to get to grips with this book. And I would say to people, don't be intimidated by the subject matter. Approach the book just out of curiosity, which frankly is probably the best way to approach any piece of literature, and enjoy it. It's there to kind of sweep you along and take you on the journey. So, I wish everyone well in doing so.
Oh, I love that. And it's immersive. It's a very immersive book. Like you say, I feel like I was swept along on the journey. And I will admit that I'm not huge into literary fiction. Like, it's one of my little dirty
Mhm.
secrets that I'm more commercial than literary, even in what I read. And
Right,
so
right.
I would definitely tell people that this is not a highbrow book that you're going to struggle to read. It's an immersive read
Absolutely.
that's going to take you on a journey. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's
True.
take a quick peek at how people can connect with you. We'll put all the links in
Mhm.
the show notes on the website on bestofwomensfiction.com, and also the link to Ian's book. But your website, on Instagram, you're at Colleen Author, double
That's
Leen
right.
author on Instagram. And then Colleen van Niekerk on .com for your website, and all your other social media are up there. And is there anything do you like to do book clubs? Is there anything that readers should know about how you like to engage with them?
I do. I really enjoy it. I think of all the different interactions that are there. I love book clubs because you're with people who are reading and have kind of gone through that road. So yeah, I have a contact form on my website. I'm, on Twitter as well as Instagram. Definitely reach out. Feedback is good. I'm happy to chat with folks as well, and answer questions. It'd be my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you today, and I couldn't rave
Mhm.
more about this book. I'm off to write my review. I need to get it done. But thank you for taking the
Thank
time to
you.
join me on the podcast here. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.